Hello, everyone. This week we are learning about nationalist leaders. So, a couple nationalist leaders we've already discussed are Gandhi and Mao Zedong. I just made a video on Ho Chi Minh. He's a nationalist leader, and I made a video on Kwame Nkrumah. He's also a nationalist leader. And now we're going to talk about Jomo Kenyatta. So, these guys are all nationalist leaders because they fought for their nation, to unify their nation under whatever belief system they wanted. So, Gandhi wanted independence from Britain. Mao Zedong wanted to unify China under communism. Ho Chi Minh wanted to unify Vietnam under communism. Uh, Nkrumah Kenyatta, not sorry, Nkrumah wanted to unify and gain independence for Ghana from Britain. And now Jomo Kenyatta also wants to unify and gain independence from Britain for Kenya. Jomo Kenyatta is a little bit easier to remember because Kenya is in his last name, or this is the name he becomes known as. So he's a little bit easier to remember what country he was trying to gain independence for. Um, Kwame Nkrumah takes Ghana and creates an independent country there. So that's why these guys are all nationalist leaders. Okay. So Jomo Kenyatta, the leader of the Kenyan independence movement, is released by British colonial authorities nearly 9 years after 9 years of imprisonment and detention. 2 years later, Kenya achieved independence and Kenyatta became prime minister. Once portrayed as a menacing symbol of African nationalism, he brought stability to the country and defended Western interests during his 15 years as Kenyan leader. Kenyatta was born in the East African highlands, southwest of Mount Kenya, sometime in the late 1890s. He was a member of the Kikuyu ethnic group, Kenyatta's largest, and was educated by Presbyterian missionaries in 1920. In 1920, Kenya formally became a British colony, and by 1921, Kenyatta was living in the colonial capital of Nairobi. There he became involved in African nationalist movements, and by 1928 had risen to the post of General Secretary of the Kikuyu Central Association, an organization opposed to the seizure of tribal lands by European settlers. In 1929, he first went to London to protest colonial policy, but authorities refused to meet with him. Kenyatta returned to London several times over the next few years to petition for African rights, and then remained in Europe in the 1930s to receive a formal education at various institutions, including Moscow University. In 1938, he published his seminal work, Facing Mount Kenya, which praised traditional Kikuyu society and discussed its plight under colonial rule. During World War II, he lived in England, lecturing and writing. In 1946, he returned to Kenya, and in 1947 became president of the newly formed Kenya African Union, or KAU. He pushed for majority rule, recruiting both Kikuyus and non-Kikuyus into a non-violent movement, but the white settler minority was unyielding in refusing a significant role for blacks in the colonial government. So many of these independence movements start off with just wanting the same rights as the Europeans that were living there. So it's important to note that when the Europeans take over these colonies in Africa, they move there. So there's British people that are living in Kenya, there's British people that were living in Ghana. When we talk about South Africa, there was British and Dutch settlers in those places and living there and discriminating against the African people that were there first. So people like Jomo Kenyatta are really just in the beginning trying to get equal rights, or let's have free elections. The reason that the white settlers don't want to have elections is because they're the minority. And if they open up the elections to the black Africans, then they're the majority. So they'll win. And that's what the white settlers are worried about. In 1946, he returned to Kenya, and that's what that part was saying. He pushed for majority rule, but the white settler minorities, they don't want that. In 1952, an extremist Kikuyu group called the Mau Mau began a guerrilla war against the settlers and colonial government, leading to bloodshed, political turmoil, and the forced internment of tens of thousands of Kikuyus in detainment camps. Kenyatta played little role in the rebellion, but he was vilified by the British and put on trial in 1952 with 5 other KUA members for managing the Mau Mau terrorist organization. An advocate of nonviolence and conservatism, he pleaded innocent in the highly politicized trial, but was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years in prison. So vilified just means that he was made to look like the bad guy by the British, even though he has nothing to do with this group, this Mau Mau terrorist organization that the British are labeling a terrorist organization. He's still found guilty. It's important to note right here, he's an advocate for nonviolence, just like another independence leader or nationalist leader that we've studied. Just remember, many of these independence movements that we're discussing start with nonviolence because these groups know that in a war, they're not going to be able to defeat the British. So they have to be smarter than the British. They have to use non cooperation, non violence. They have to just make their life miserable to the point where they want to leave. He spent 6 years in jail and then was sent to an internal exile in Lodwar, where he lived under house arrest. Meanwhile, the British government slowly began steering Kenya to black majority rule. In 1960, the Kenya African National Union, or KANU, was organized by black nationalists, and Kenyatta was elected president in absentia, which just means that even though he wasn't there, he was elected president. The party announced that it would not take part in any government until Kenyatta was freed. Kenyatta pledged the protection of settlers' rights in an independent Kenya, and on August 14, 1961, he was finally allowed to return to Kikuyu land. After a week of house arrest in the company of his family and supporters, he was formally released on August 21st. In 1962, he went to London to negotiate Kenyan independence, and in May 1963, he led the KANU to victory in pre-independence elections. On December 12, 1963, Kenya celebrated its independence, and Kenyatta formally became prime minister. The next year, a new constitution established Kenya as a republic, and Kenyatta was elected president. As Kenya's leader until his death in 1978, Kenyatta encouraged racial cooperation, promoted capitalist economic policies, and adapted pro-Western foreign policy. He used his authority to suppress political opposition, particularly from radical groups. Under his rule, Kenya became a one-state party, and the stability that resulted attracted foreign investment in Kenya. After he died on August 22, 1978, he was succeeded by Daniel Arap Moi, who continued most of his policies, affectionately known in his later years as Mzee or Old Man in Swahili. Kenyatta is celebrated as the founding father of Kenya. He was also influential throughout Africa. So that last paragraph makes Kenyatta sound like he was really great, but you can tell right here that the United States view him that way because he used capitalist policies, he was pro-Western, and this was during the time of the Cold War. So the more countries we have on our side, the better for us. So even though he was practiced capitalism, he liked the West, he also, though, uses his authority to keep his power. He suppresses political opposition, which isn't very democratic at all. He has his country be a one-party state, meaning so there's only one political party. There's no other political parties. You can't have different ideas than Jomo Kenyatta has. So I just wanted to point that out to you guys. Okay. All right. You have 2 questions to answer here. Thank you.